Good morning again, everyone. The second question that I want to deal with today is the issue of Europe's population explosion and the reasons for a 57% increase in population over a 1 century period. The population of Europe in 1700 was about 120 million. By the end of the century, by the turn of the 19th century, that population had grown from 120 million to 190 million people. Historians have long tried to figure out why those changes happened. They've disagreed on the causes of this demographic revolution. They've studied death registers, marriage records, death and burial documents to try to figure out why this population increase happened. Okay, there are a couple of basic ideas. One, we know that Europe's birth rate increased significantly after 1740. Now, if you look, that's roughly the same time that people start planting rice and potatoes and tomatoes and chestnuts. So you can make the argument that increased food supply was one of the reasons why these things began to happen. At the same time, you see death rates decreasing equally dramatically. So people are living longer in most parts of Europe, and they're dying of different diseases and dying at a different time in life. So the combination of rising birth rates and declining mortality rates are going to lead to this population increase. Now, it's important to remember that there wasn't one particular spike or one particular boom period in terms of population. The best example of a boom period that we can look at is the post-World War II baby boom in America, where we averaged about 4.1 million live births over an 18-year period, 79 million births. That didn't happen. Okay, but at the same time, let's take a look at numbers of major countries and see what their populations did. Okay, Great Britain, population in 1700 is 9 million. By 1740, the population's about 10.5 million. So you've had some increase, but not anywhere near what would happen by the end of the century. By 1800, Great Britain's population would be 16.5 million. So you almost have a doubling of the population in this century. In France, 1700, the population's 19 million. By the end of the century, you have an increase to 28 million. In Russia, you have 17.5 million people in 1700. They more than double their population by 1800 and going to 37 million. Okay? So you see that these things are generally happening over the course of the century, but dramatically happening in the period after 1740. Okay, now the changes tend to happen first in the areas that are densely populated to begin with and have significant agricultural production. Places like England, the Netherlands, northern Italy, northern France are going to see their populations rise the quickest. Okay, now think about that. More food, more rice, more tomatoes, more turnips, more potatoes, all of the things that we talk about, better diet equaling better life, starts happening in these areas, and what do? They get busy, they have more kids, those kids survive, they live longer, population increases. Okay? Now, life expectancy grows after epidemics, disasters, and wars decrease. Okay, it's not to say that those things didn't continue, but what historians will argue is that they happen less often. Okay, for instance, in Paris in 1719, 14,000 people die of smallpox. There isn't a record of another string of deaths that size through the rest of the 18th century because of a single disease. Okay, you'll have malaria regularly in Spain in the 1780s and 90s, but you see very little mention of it at any other point in the century. Okay, in 1769, 5% of the French population is going to die of hunger. So, on one hand, you can say that the instances still happen, but those instances are not as dramatic as those that had happened in previous centuries. Okay, now, with that as a backdrop, you need to keep a couple things in mind. One, if you look at the French life expectancy during the 18th century, both men and women live an average of 29 years. Even in relatively advanced Sweden, men only live to 33, women only live to 36. So, what does that tell you as a 17 or 18-year-old student in high school? And I think one of you mentioned the fact that it was midlife crisis time for people your age during the 18th century. And that would be right. What you saw as a result was younger marriage, more children, those children living longer. That's going to become an issue. Okay? We're going to have life expectancy increases for other reasons as well. In England, they're going to develop a vaccine against smallpox, which was one of the great child killers of past centuries. Okay, you're going to see a 70% decrease in deaths due to smallpox. You're going to begin to see the use of quinine as a means of abating fevers. Now, you look at the mortality rate across the board. The single greatest killer of the 16th, 17th century were the fevers that would go uncontrolled and not stopped. The medical societies in France, England, states in what we now know as Germany also started arguing for two other very important things. One, that we stop burying dead bodies inside city limits, inside high population areas. Dead bodies, diseases kind of go together. You want to prevent that. So they start taking more care in where the cemeteries are going to be. The second piece involved in that is we do a better job of getting rid of waste in high volume areas. So in London, in Paris, etc. We do a better job of getting rid of our garbage. So garbage and filth creates disease, which leads to death. Okay? So those things are going to be major impacts on the reason we have a population explosion. Okay? We're going to have changes in warfare as well. Now, if you think back to the wars of the 16th and 17th century, those wars often involved civilian deaths in large numbers. Half of the deaths in the 30 Years' War, for instance, came because of civilians being killed. One of the things we will see in this century is the development of professional armies with more discipline, and those armies are told not to kill civilians. So failure to kill civilians in wars like the 7 Years' War, etc., are going to mean greater life expectancy for the population as a whole. Now, there were some who made the argument that this population growth wasn't necessarily a good thing. Late in the 18th century, an English cleric by the name of Thomas Malthus is going to write an essay on the principle of population. And he makes the prediction that natural checks in population growth, things like smallpox, fevers, measles, diseases, are going to become less important over time, and at some point in time, they're going to become insignificant. Okay? Growth of population, according to Malthus, is going to become exponential, while growth in the food supply is going to remain numerical, is going to remain arithmetical. Okay? So eventually, population is going to become a major pressure on the way people live. Now, Malthus makes these predictions, but he doesn't really understand that some people are already trying to limit families. You look at, French historians, they say that coitus interruptus is a cause in the slowing of the birth rate after 1770. James Boswell is going to talk some other things, and I'm going to finish this